One of my very favorite things about being your minister is those moments where what I've planned for worship and what the musicians have planned for worship just come together in perfect fashion without us having planned it. And I'm glad to know we can still do that online. Thank you to Clayvaz Virtual and all of our online musicians. So earlier today, I talked about the story of poor old Copernicus. The outcome of that story and the correctness of Copernicus's brave new idea seem obvious now. But hundreds of years ago, that was a really big deal. Today, there is an ongoing struggle for recognition of the full humanity of many of our neighbors, the people of color, the queer community, immigrants. And that's a really big deal. Now, assuming that the human race has not committed self-extinction by then, I wonder what our descendants will think hundreds of years from now. What a time to be alive. Our story is unfolding in some very interesting ways. The NFL is showing love to Colin Kaepernick. NASCAR has stopped flying the Confederate flag. TikTok and K-pop stans just used their tech savvy to troll the president in one of the most epic senior class pranks of all time. The Harry Potter fandom has risen up en masse against the intolerance voiced by its creator. And even our pancake syrup logos are a point of contention for those who would cling to a narrow version of history written only by those with power. Around the country, memorials honoring Confederate leaders are coming down. Even the statue of Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia. I honestly never thought I would see the day. To quote another Southerner, William Faulkner, the past isn't dead. It isn't even past. Now, I'm a Southern girl through and through. I have never lived north of the Mason-Dixon line. I know where the Mason-Dixon line is. I've lived in Flannery O'Connor's hometown in Georgia and in the heart of the land of Lee and Jefferson, an hour's drive from Monticello. I can never remember. Arkansas has a town that's named the other pronunciation, and so I get confused. I have watched the laser light show at Stone Mountain, the Mount Rushmore of the Confederacy. If you've never heard of it, good for you. I grew up hearing about the Little Rock Nine as local history, and I love a lot of things about being Southern. Hospitality and helpfulness and community-mindedness, faithfulness, and food. While knowing that these things that I love have been denied to my siblings of color, in addition to the violence inherent in a deeply racist system. All of this informs my work for justice, my ministry, and who I am as a person. I want to talk about self-authorization. It's a term I heard used in seminary, and it stuck with me as being really perfect. Not authorization in the sense of giving permission, right? I authorize you. But authorization in the sense of being the author of yourself and your story. But when a lot of that story comes from chapters that we did not write, whether it is cultural heritage, national identity, race, class background, family of origin, how can we self-authorize? How can we write our own story when so much has already been written? How do we decide what to claim regarding the things we can't change? A note that choosing what you claim is not the same as the option of choosing to ignore parts of our history. That might be our privilege talking when we want to do that. We have to grapple with all of who we are. A lesson in this comes from my very favorite episode of Doctor Who. Part of my identity is also deeply, deeply geeky. So the Doctor is trying to console his companion. Their efforts to save a life have failed. I won't give you spoilers because it's really good. And he says essentially to his companion, everyone has a pile of good things and a pile of bad things in their life. And the good things don't outweigh the bad things, but the bad things also don't outweigh the good things. We have to take them both and do what we can to add to the pile of good. And the fact that there is also a pile of bad does not take away from the good that we do. And he was talking about a personal, individual life. But I think that is also true when we think about the larger identity that we have in terms of where we come from and the things we cannot change. It means we don't only get to look at the good pile and ignore the bad pile. It means that we get to decide what it means to us. But nothing is ever just about me, not about one person, not even my own story, and certainly not the way my self-authored story intersects with our heritage and history. I don't get to choose any story I want just because I like it. And I've learned to be suspicious of any story that feels too easy, too comfortable an explanation. To doubt any story where there is a clear victor or no victims, especially when that victor looks like me. Because history matters. And history, historically, is told not just by the victors, but specifically by those with power. There is a reason most of us never learned about the Tulsa Race Massacre in our history classes. It is the same reason so many of us cut out construction paper feathers and pilgrims' hats to wear in Thanksgiving plays when we were kids. That very much did not look like history. I was an adult when I learned about Little Rock's own Black Wall Street, a term for a corridor of commerce and community, primarily for the use of Black residents. Little Rock had such an area itself with a rich and storied history, all of which was shut down long before I got there. But history matters, even the history that one might try to forget. Not just the history of the victorious and the powerful, but the history of all of it. But Reverend Sarah, you might say the Confederates were not victorious. Robert E. Lee surrendered. The Civil War is over. How is that the same thing? The Civil War is over. Is it really? Maybe it's just a Cold War. Speaking of history, most of those monuments that are coming down were not put up immediately following the Civil War, but as part of a dedicated campaign to glorify a South that never was. In the decades after the Civil War, commemorative markers tended to be memorials for mourned soldiers who had died. According to Mark Elliott, a history professor at UNC Greensboro, he says, eventually they started to build Confederate monuments. The vast majority of them were built in the 1890s and 1950s, which matched up exactly with the era of Jim Crow segregation. According to Southern Poverty Law Center's research, the biggest spike in these monuments was between 1900 and the 1920s. In contrast to the earlier monuments mourning dead soldiers, these monuments glorified leaders of the Confederacy, like Robert E. Lee. Elliott explains all of these monuments were there to teach values to people. That's why they put them in city squares. That's why they put them in front of state buildings. Most earlier memorials were in cemeteries. The values these monuments stood for included a glorification of the cause of civil war. History matters. Who has the power? Who's telling the story? And the question that sometimes gets left out, but is maybe most important, who is left out of that story? The whole story of history exists independently of any individual. But what lessons we learn and what heroes we choose That is part of the story that we write. Thinking about where we come from is not just about history and heritage. It is also deeply intimate and personal. As we heard from Tan Nu Tinin earlier, there is an interconnectedness between the stories of nations, communities, families, and individuals. I'm indebted to some of my beloved friends and family who have shared their stories of trauma with me, whether it is trauma of war, or the trauma of domestic abuse, or any of the other traumas that history and home may offer. Because in choosing their stories, choosing to see themselves as survivors rather than victims of someone else's story, they have done some of the most courageous self-authorization that I have ever witnessed. When we name our past, it begins to lose some of its power over us. What are the stories you tell about yourself? Where did those stories come from? When did they start? Who first told them to you? Who has the power? Who is telling the story? And who is left out? These are great questions in constructing capital H history, but they're also valuable in building a personal narrative history that is whole and healing. So I want to issue a creative challenge. Earlier in the service, we heard a poem, Where I'm From, by George Ella Lyon. This is a famously taught poem because it is easily riffed on, if you will. So our creative challenge for this week, which I hope you'll come to Wednesday at the Well and share with Hallie Moore, is to write your own version of the poem that we heard earlier. I will post it in the Facebook group as well as on our YouTube channel. We have a YouTube channel now. And also a reminder in the Beacon Bits on Wednesday. Good luck. Revisionist history gets a bad rap because history has already been revised by those with power and those with authority. There's that root word again. Those with authority author history. It is our job to continually revise and revisit history until the whole story is told, or at least as complete as we can make it. Whether our own personal history or capital H history. It is our job to revise and revisit history, and as a poet, I know that revision is what turns a rough draft into art. I leave you with a final object lesson. I mentioned the statue of Lee in Richmond that is slated for removal earlier in the service. Now, activists and artists have taken it upon themselves to do a bit of revising and revision to that monument before it is removed. First, it was covered in graffiti affirming that Black Lives Matter, that police brutality must end, and celebrating the impending removal in no uncertain terms. Now, this description does not do justice to the beauty of this street art. And then young Black dancers came and danced and raised fists and posed with pride and defiance against that backdrop. Their striking photographs, leaving no question of who was claiming power and who was telling their story. And finally, another artist projected the image of Harriet Tubman onto the monument. Above her head, the words, "Slavery is the next thing to hell." The initials of Black Lives Matter projected onto the statue itself. I'm going to show that in a minute. These layers of reclamation, as powerful as they are, as healing as they may be, do not erase history. They remind us of it, and they continue it. History is not done with us yet. They celebrate the resilience of survival and rage for those who did not. They inspire us to do better and to be better. May we be as bold and as magnificent as these truth-telling artists have been in claiming our own stories.